Welcome to Personal Landscapes. I'm your host, Ryan Murdoch. You can find links for today's episode and other conversations on Books About Place at ryanmurdoch.com. The Mediterranean was a surprisingly interconnected place in the Late Bronze Age. Trade flourished between Greece, Egypt, and the Near East, along with trade embargoes, embassies, and diplomatic marriages. It was a lot like our own globalized economy in microcosm. And then something terrible happened that brought it all to an end. Large empires and small kingdoms that had been flourishing for centuries all collapsed at around the same time. It was as though civilization itself had been wiped away. Most or all of the advances of the previous centuries vanished, ushering in a long dark age. I got interested in the Late Bronze Age collapse after my first trip to Greece and the Peloponnese. I wanted to know more, and so I reached out to Eric Cline, professor of classics and anthropology at George Washington University. He's the author of 1177 BC, the year civilization collapsed, and after 1177 BC, the survival of civilizations. We spoke about why some civilizations vanished and others thrived, and why future historians might look at 2020 in the same way that we look at 1177 BC. Before we begin, I want to take a second to tell you about my new book. It's called A Sunny Place for Shady People, and it's about 6 years I spent on the island of Malta. I wanted to write a breezy island book inspired by Lawrence Durrell, and so I moved to a country I'd never visited in the middle of the Mediterranean. And that's when things started to go wrong. I watched as an organized criminal network took over the government of a European Union member state with the widespread support of its citizens. It culminated in the brutal car bomb assassination of a writer that I admired, the investigative journalist Daphne Caruana Galizia. The office of the Prime Minister was implicated in her murder, but no politicians have been arrested or charged. I'm convinced that the roots of it all are deeply embedded in the culture. A Sunny Place for Shady People is available now from Trinity University Press and from booksellers everywhere. I hope you'll check it out. And now, here's my conversation with Eric Cline on the Late Bronze Age collapse. So I first got interested in this period 4 or 5 years ago. After my first trip to Greece, we went to the Peloponnese because I wanted to see Agamemnon's palace and the Lion Gate. And it was startling to think that for the Greeks of classical Athens, the ruins of Mycenaean Tiryns were relics of a past so distant it was shrouded in mystery even to them. But that world isn't as alien to us today as we might imagine. So could you paint us a picture of that late Bronze Age world?
Yeah, sure. And first of all, thank you for having me on. It's a pleasure to be here. It's not that foreign to us because of Homer, because so many people have read the Iliad and the Odyssey, or they saw the movie Troy with Brad Pitt, or they wish they hadn't seen the movie with Brad Pitt. But we know, a lot of us know about the Trojan War, and therefore we know about Agamemnon and Mycenae. And of course, as you just said, so many people go to Greece as tourists these days. And if you go down to the Peloponnese and that region, then Mycenae is one of the major places to go. So people are familiar with it, but they don't know the details. And so that's the period that I've been interested in my entire life. Like, I first read a book on Troy when I was 7 years old. And I declared to my parents I was going to become an archaeologist, and lo and behold, here we are. So the Late Bronze Age, this is where we are. This is not quite 4,000 years ago. We're talking second millennium BC, right, or BCE, depending on your preference. I use both interchangeably. But I'm really looking at the period from about 1700 to 1200 BC. And that is what we call the Late Bronze Age in the Aegean region and the Eastern Mediterranean. So from, say, Greece, or you could even take it to Italy on the west in modern terms, all the way over to Iran or Afghanistan, and then that would be on the east, and then from, say, Turkey down to Egypt. again, in modern terms, from north to south. So this is the area that is basically from Western Mediterranean to Eastern Mediterranean, let's put it that way. And in these 500 years, from 1700 to 1200 BC, we have what I call the G8 of the ancient world, right? So you've got Minoans and Mycenaeans in the Aegean. You've got Hittites in what is now Turkey, ancient Anatolia, Cypriots, Egyptians, Canaanites on what is now Israel, Lebanon, Syria, then Assyrians and Babylonians in Mesopotamia, which would be like modern day Iraq. And for those 500 years, those societies, those civilizations are happily interacting. They're trading with each other commercially for raw materials and finished goods. They're signing peace treaties. They're doing diplomacy. They're marrying each other's daughters to cement the treaties, things like that. So they're happily interacting for about 500 years. And then all of a sudden, everything comes crashing down in just a couple of decades, right after 1200 BC. That's setting the context for what we're going to talk about.
Perfect. Yeah, I want to dig into a little bit more of these civilizations because I was really surprised by how interconnected they are at that time.
Mm-hmm.
The trade routes, trade embargoes you mentioned, embassies, diplomatic marriages. Do we know about these links because of the Amarna letters?
In part, yes. The Amarna letters are a treasure trove, shall we say. Right. So the Amarna archive are the letters in the royal archive of Amenhotep III and his son Akhenaten, the heretic pharaoh. So this would put us in the middle of the 14th century BC. And the Amarna letters, which actually I've been working on recently, are a combination of letters between the great kings, so the pharaoh to the king of the Assyrians, the king of the Babylonians to the Egyptian pharaoh, and letters from the petty vassal kings in Canaan. So we have we have 6 letters from the governor, king, mayor, whatever you want to call them, of Megiddo, for example, to the Egyptian pharaoh, mostly asking for help. Also, a letter from the king of Jerusalem, letter from the king of Hatzor. These are all vassal states that owe allegiance to Egypt in this period. So it's an interesting combination in the Amarna archive of these royal letters. And that is one of the sources that we've got for this period, because as texts written contemporaneously, they are chock full of information about things like you mentioned, diplomacy, commerce, gift giving, things like that.
So what would be the tone of one of these letters? Like, how do these guys talk to each other?
Well, it really depended on the social status, let's put it this way. If it were a lesser king to the superior king, like the vassal king of Megiddo writing to the Egyptian pharaoh, he would call the Egyptian pharaoh my father, and he would refer to himself as your son. So it was, and they're pretending they're families so that they can trade, right? So it was my father, my son. If they were both kings, but one was of subservient status, like king of Cyprus to king of Egypt, it would also be like my father, my son. But if they were equal, like the king of Assyria or the king of Mitanni or the king of Babylon to the king of Egypt, it would be my brother. Say to my brother, thus says your brother. And so again, it was family, but that was equal. There is one other possibility. The father-son could have been an age thing, where you're deferential to the elder, but I think more likely it's a social status. Regardless, they had a formula where they would start out with, say to the king, thus says so and so. And that's because the kings themselves were probably illiterate. So they're talking to the scribes, right? One scribe says to the other scribe, say to your king, thus says my king, right? And then they go on and I fall 7 times and 7 times over at the feet of my majesty. Please send me archers and this and that. The letters between the equal kings start out with what we would call today a personal communication, right? Where you start a telephone call and you're doing the, how's the family, this and that, and then, okay, let's get down to business. They did the same thing. Greetings from myself, my wife, my family, my head huntsman, to your wife, your family, your head huntsman. May your chariots and horses be good. My chariots and horses are good. And they would go on like this, where they would frequently fill up the entire front of the tablet with these customary greetings. And then, on the back, they would go, okay, now let's get down to business. I need gold and I need lots of gold. Send me gold right now. Right. So that's what's in these Amarna letters. They are unique, though. We have other archives, such as at the site of Ugarit, which is on the what is now the north coast of Syria. And there, in those archives, we've got a variety of letters, but we also have kind of accounting text and so on. And those are much more what you might imagine. Send me this, send me that, I'll send you this. So the ones at the Amarna archive are fascinating because they are literally letters between rulers, and we can tease out the information in them. And of course, they didn't know we'd be reading them 3,500 years ago. So there's some interesting bits in those letters.
So what language would that be written in? What was the lingua franca of the region?
Yeah, interesting question. So the lingua franca of those is Akkadian. So Akkadian, well, and first of all, they're using the writing script cuneiform,
Mhm.
which looks like a bird stepped in ink and walked across the page, right? It's all these wedges that you could stick into the wet clay. So Akkadian, which is basically uh, used in Mesopotamia, just like Assyrian and Babylonian, you've got Akkadian. But if you are Egyptian, your scribe is going to be able to read, write, and everything else in Egyptian and Akkadian. If you're up in the Hittite court, the scribes there would be able to read, write Hittite and Akkadian, right? If you're in Mesopotamia, you're lucky, you just need Akkadian. So, but even there are dialects. So the vassal kings are writing in what's known as Amarna Akkadian, and it's a dialect. It's colloquial, just like, today you can tell if somebody's from the South or from Maine or from California. So you can kind of tell where the scribes are writing from, depending on the dialect they're using.
So why was Akkadian chosen? I mean, were they the most powerful? Would Egypt have been the most powerful, but their writing system just too complicated for everybody to master?
Um, Hard to say, and the thing is, the Akkadians per se were long gone by this point. The
Hmm.
Akkadian Empire was 500 to 1,000 years earlier. They were ruling, say, in the 25th century BC and had been knocked out by an earlier drought sometime after 2200 BC. So Sargon of Akkad is the one we talk about, ruling in about 2334 BC, if I remember my dates correctly, and his grandson Naram Sin. So those were the original Akkadians. After them come the Babylonians and the Assyrians as kind of, later successors, but they are still using this language and the writing system and all of that, though essentially Assyrian and Babylonian are also dialects of the original Akkadian. So it wasn't that they were the most powerful, they weren't even around anymore, but it became the diplomatic language. I mean, you could ask exactly the same question as to why was French the diplomatic lingua franca in Benjamin Franklin's day, right? No good reason, but it was. So, um, so that's a long answer to your short question, but it was I guess, I hadn't thought of it this way, but it didn't privilege anybody then over anybody
Oh,
else.
yeah, that's interesting.
Right? Yeah, I mean, if it privileged anybody, it's Assyrians and Babylonians, but even then, but yeah, I think Egyptian would have been a little bit too hard for everyone to learn. And Hittites written using cuneiform also, but that's different too. So it just happened. same way French happened.
So, what was the importance of royal gifts in this period? You talked about kind of royal gifts being
Yeah.
something like this disguised trade.
Yeah, that's I really like this idea here. So this is gift giving. And what we see in the royal letters, especially in the Amarna archives, is one pharaoh saying to another, I am sending you as my greeting gift 2 chariots, 5 pairs of horses, perfume, this, that, and the other. And then they're pretty blatant usually, and they say, in return, and usually if they're writing to Egypt, it's send me gold, send me lots of gold, send me gold right now, right? Because that's what they wanted. But occasionally they didn't specify it. But then what happened was, and we do the same thing today, if you got a gift from a king, you always sent a greeting gift with the letter, but then you also sent other stuff. And if you, as the recipient, did not then give the same equivalent back, that was no go. And you were called out on it, right? So we have letters that say, I sent you a greeting gift and you didn't send me anything. Or you sent me 5 golden statues, which when I melted them down, turned out not to be made of gold anyway. And you're like, wait, you put my gift in your melting pot and melted it down? Well, anyway, what I think is going on at this point, because there is commercial trade at a lower level, I think it was beneath the royalty to engage in commercial activities. And, that's just me reading into it, but that's what I see again and again and again, because you never see them selling or bartering or anything. I mean, even though you don't have a monetary economy yet because they haven't invented coins, those won't be around till the 7th century, but still, tit for tat, you knew what it was. And silver was worth so much tin and it was worth so much gold. You could have done mercantile exchanges. I think it was beneath the royalty. Instead, they gave gifts out of the goodness of my heart. And but it's disguised. It's disguised trade. And anthropologists have studied this, the whole idea of gift giving. And one of the ways that you do it is by pretending that you're all members of the same family. Hence, my brother, my son, my father. And you're like, I'm not trading, I'm not selling, I'm giving you a gift because I love you, right? But, okay, so we do this still today, right? You have a birthday or you have whatever, Christmas, Hanukkah, Kwanzaa, something where you give gifts. And if you give me, say, 2 tickets to a Springsteen concert, and I give you a pack of juicy fruit bubble gum, you're going to go, hey, wait a minute. This is not equal. One of these things is wrong. And the next year, you'll be like, hey, here's some juicy fruit, because you didn't give me Springsteen tickets. And I'll be like, oh, that's interesting because this year I'm giving you Earth, Wind, and Fire tickets. We have this equivalency unstated. They had it back then too. So I think that what they're doing really is commercial activity, just in another name, right? If that makes sense,
Mhm.
right? So I do think it was beneath them. Kings don't do that. Regular people do that. But the one thing to add here is they would frequently send caravans back and forth, which contained the gifts, including when they had marriages, and the dowries and the bride price was amazing. Like it went over 2 or 3 tablets with 300 lines worth of gifts, right? So frequently the messengers that went with the caravans were also diplomats, or vice versa. The diplomats that were sent were also messengers and merchants. So they kind of combined everything. And we see frequently in the letters where one king says to another, can you send my guy back? He went there with a message. He's been there 3 years. Can you send him back, please? Right. So, everybody has multiple purposes. Let's put it that way.
And this must have been a great conduit for the spread of ideas as well,
I
because
think
the
so.
people who were going with these these caravans are taking these ideas with them and gossiping, and talking about it. And
Exactly. Yes, I think so. And especially when you get something, for instance, when you're sending something to Greece, which we know the Egyptians did, and to your pal Agamemnon and the Mycenaeans, we know, for example, that there are these plaques made of faience, which are some material kind of halfway between pottery and glass. And they have the cartouche, the name of Amenhotep III, same guy with the Amarna letters. And there's about 10 of them at Mycenae, which is very unusual. They're not found anywhere else. So at Mycenae and at Pylos and at Knossos and other places, you have the Linear B tablets, which is what the Mycenaeans are recording. They're not using cuneiform. They're not using Akkadian. They're writing in their own language, which is an early version of Greek, right? Michael Ventris was able to prove that in 1952. But those Linear B tablets are accounting tablets. This many chariot wheels coming into the palace, this much copper or bronze going out. Well, some of the things that they mention are Near Eastern or Egyptian. For instance, sesame, like we use sesame today, the name on Linear B is Sasama, but it's originally a Near Eastern name. Same with ivory. Ivory, Elef, is originally like a Hittite name, and even the name for gold, and so on. So, what I think in those cases is that the name came with the objects, right? You bring something into port and you're selling it at like Pylos, and you're like, so what is this? Oh, this is sasama. It's sesame. Yeah, you put it in your food. What's it called? Sasama. Oh, okay. Right. And so there you've got the name coming with the object. And I think the ideas came as well. And there, I think, yes, you could have ideas at the highest royal levels, but let's put it down to the nuts and bolts. I think the main place for ideas and stories to be swapped is the sailors,
yeah,
right? The guys that are actually manning the ships, and they sail from Egypt to Greece and they load up their ship, but the wind is wrong. So they're sitting in port for 6 weeks waiting for the wind to shift. Well, what do you do if you're a sailor? You go to the local inn and you drink, right? And as you're drinking, you're swapping tall tales and singing songs, telling poems. I think that is how a lot of the communication went on, is at the lower levels of society. And it's been suggested, and this is jumping ahead of ourselves, but later when the Phoenician alphabet came to Greece, right, which may have been as early as the 11th century, certainly by the 8th century, it has been suggested that the Phoenician alphabet was adopted first in the port cities, with one sailor saying to another, here, let me write this down for you. We have a new way of writing, and it's much easier than cuneiform or hieroglyphs or whatever. So I don't want to undersell the main people that are manning the boats, and I think they're extremely important. So yes, even with the caravans back in the Near East, I think that the ideas are coming along with the objects, and that's how influences and everything else are spread. I think you'd be right about that.
yeah. It's interesting that you mentioned the trade and sailors. The other great find in your book that I was really impressed by was the Ulubran ship. The range of
Hmm.
trade goods that it contained was really astonishing.
Oh yeah, yeah. The Ula ship is amazing. For me, it's a microcosm of the trade that was going on at that time. So this so ship that went down off the coast of what is now Turkey, ancient Anatolia, in about 1300 BC, give or take, within 5 years either way, but certainly by about 1300. And the cargo on board, there's at least seven different societies represented in the cargo, right? We've got Egyptian stuff, we've got Mycenaean pottery, Minoan pottery, we've got literally tons of Cypriot copper, like 10 tons of it. We've also got a ton of tin, which probably comes from Central Asia Afghanistan, Turkmenistan. There have been some indications that some of it might come from southeastern Anatolia. Some people want it to come from Cornwall, but I don't think that they're going up to Cornwall that often at that point for tin. But so we've got, as I say, about 7 different societies on board, and absolutely amazing stuff. Gold, silver, as I said, copper and tin, and finished objects as well, including some drinking cups made out of this material faience that I mentioned, which are known in the Near East as Bibru, Bibru, translated from the Akkadian. And those are drinking cups reserved for royalty. Well, there are 5 or 6 of them on this ship. So we're still trying to figure out what the ship was. It's been suggested it was a wealthy private merchant sailing around and selling stuff. It's been suggested it was a gift from one king to another, such as we see in the Amarna letters. And if that's the case, then which king sent it and which king was getting it? Or a colleague and I at one point suggested it was actually a ship that was sent from Greece to the Eastern Mediterranean on a shopping trip, right? We need perfume, we need copper, we need tin, and while you're out, get some milk and sugar, and then come on back. But whoever sent it and whoever it was going to, neither of which we know for sure, it went down. And I like to say it went down one dark and stormy night, as the novels begin. But somebody lost a fortune, absolute fortune. Somebody, I think, went bankrupt as a reason because of this. As George Bass, the original excavator of the ship, said, that amount, 10 tons of copper and 1 ton of tin, you need that to make bronze. That's enough copper and tin to make to outfit an army of 300 soldiers with helmets and swords and shields and greaves and all of that. That's a lot of copper and tin. That's expensive.
You said the crew was also multinational, but there were at least 2 Mycenaeans on board, but it was a Canaanite ship.
As far as we can tell, yes. It's always hard when you don't have writing to figure out exactly what is what. But yeah, thinking is it's probably a Canaanite ship. Could be an Egyptian ship for that matter. It could also be Cypriot ship. We just don't know. The reason we think the crew is multinational is because of the personal items that are on board the ship, and they span the gamut. There is used Mycenaean and Minoan pottery on board, which is why we think there were at least 2 Mycenaeans or maybe Minoans on board. There are also at least 2 different weight systems that were found, like little balance pan weights made of stone, which means we think there were merchants on board. But there are also little gold pendants that you would have worn around your neck as a necklace. And those are Canaanite. We actually see almost exact parallels that in burials in Canaan at that same time. So I think it's definitely multinational. And again, we have a parallel to today. Many of the cargo ships, the merchant ships sailing on the world today have multinational crews. And they're also, they're listed in one country, but flying the flag of another or whatever. So yeah, it looks like it was multinational back then for the crew and for the cargo, which, I mean, again, if you stop to think about it, not surprising. Even a Cypriot ship may well have had a Canaanite on board if they knew he was a good sailor or whatever. Yeah. So, but open to debate. We don't know for sure because there's no writing on board the ship. There are 2 folded wooden tablets that would have had writing originally on the wax that was inside, but the wax, of course, has gone because of the seawater. So everything is guesswork, shall we say, scholarly guesswork, but guesswork nonetheless.
So you mentioned tin a moment ago. You said you compared trade in tin in the late Bronze Age to crude oil in the 20th century.
Yes, right. Which is An example I borrowed from a friend and colleague, Carol Bell, who's in England. And Carol originally is the one that said that tin for them is like oil for us today, because tin, as I mentioned earlier, some of it might have come from what is now southeastern Turkey or Cornwall, but the vast majority we know from the texts as well as from actually testing the tin that the majority comes from what today we would call Central Asia, Afghanistan. In fact, in particular, the Badakhshan region of Afghanistan, which is where lapis lazuli also comes from. Right. So tin would have been equivalent to petroleum, but that is getting a little dated today. I'm old enough to remember the gas lines in the 70s, right, when OPEC was doing things. But maybe an analogy today would be better to, like, say, to raw earth of some kind, like lithium, right? The problem with lithium is, if there's a supply chain shortage, there go your chips in your computer and in your car and everything else. So I would now add to it that it's equivalent to petroleum or to things like lithium, which brings it up to date, shall we say. But the point that is made is that tin was incredibly important because to make bronze, you need 90% copper and 10% tin. That's how you make bronze. If you don't have tin, you can use arsenic. I don't recommend it. You'll be dead within a couple of days. I remember the book Arsenic and Old Lace, right?
Yeah,
Don't
yeah.
put the arsenic in your tea, right? So tin was incredibly important because without tin you couldn't make bronze, and that's one of the questions we have about the problems at the end of the late Bronze Age. Were the supply lines for getting tin cut? In which case you have trouble then making bronze and everything cascades. But we're going back and forth on that. It used to be thought like 70s, 80s. Oh yeah, they couldn't get tin at the end of the Bronze Age. Now we're like, they might have been able to, and they might have wanted to switch over to iron for a different reason. So lots of scholarly debates. But yeah, tin, incredibly important back then.
The other thing that surprised me as well about this interconnection between these places was you mentioned trade embargoes.
Yeah, yes, maybe, maybe. Well, yes, and maybe. Okay, fine. So, there is one text that is rather well known. It's a Hittite text, and it's basically a treaty, Shashagumuru of Amuru, which the state of Amuru was North Syria,
Mm.
and they had a complex relationship with the Hittites. So this is a Hittite king, Tutaliya IV, signing a treaty with Shashagamura, wonderful names back then. And among other things, since the Hittites were at war with the Assyrians, it says in the text, let no ship of the Akiyawa go to him. In other words, Akiyawa, wherever that might have been, and I personally think those are the Mycenaeans, are not allowed to go to the Assyrians. So since Amuru is on the north coast of Syria, the Mycenaeans coming from Greece would have had to land at a port in North Syria and then go inland to Mesopotamia to get to the Assyrians. So this is a trade embargo against it's actually against the Assyrians, but it's saying Akiyawa can't go to them. So we have in writing that. So, and I think that's the only way to describe it is as an embargo. But the other thing, and this is harder to prove, if you take a look at the actual artifacts that were being traded around at that time, not just raw materials, but finished goods. And this is actually something I started studying for my dissertation way back when dinosaurs were roaming the earth. And I was collecting, in Greece, for example, everything that had come from Egypt or the Hittites or Canaan or Cyprus that is found in late Bronze Age context. In other words, what is the actual evidence for trade? Well, if you're holding up an Egyptian object, that you've uncovered at Mycenae, it's pretty clear that there was trade that got that there. Right. I also did vice versa, looking in Hittite Anatolia, for example, how much stuff was there from other societies. So up in Hittite Anatolia, the central homelands, like near where Ankara is today, a fair number of Egyptian imports, a fair number of Cypriot and Canaanite imports, virtually no Mycenaean imports, like almost none. And if you go over to Greece, lots of Egyptian imports, lots of Syro-Palestinian or Canaanite, almost no Hittite objects. And so I, at one point, put out a theory, actually, a hypothesis, not a theory, but I put out the hypothesis that the Hittites had an embargo against the Mycenaeans for whatever reason. And so you're not trading stuff between those two because those are the only two that I could see that did not trade, and there wasn't a good reason for it because the Mycenaeans can get to the Hittites easily if they want to, and vice versa. And so I was thinking, so what could be the problem? What's the possibility? West coast of Turkey, west coast of Anatolia. Troy is up in the northern part. We have written evidence from Hittite records that the Mycenaeans were a pain in the rear end to the Hittites on the western coast. And the Trojan War may even be part of that. So I speculated that because the Mycenaeans were causing the Hittites problems on the western coast, they're like, screw it, embargo, we're not trading with them. And that went on for, a century or two. So on the one hand, for all of this, we have textual evidence. And for the other, we have circumstantial artifactual evidence. Let's put it that way, right? So, but the conclusion I came to is that they're doing things just like we're doing today, right? Not only did they have that situation, but we have other situations where it's pretty clear that a diplomatic embassy was sent. So we've got all sorts of things, right? And then, and as you mentioned earlier, in the text, we also not only know about the marriages, we know about the messy divorces at that time. So, nothing's changed. Life back then was as complicated as it is today, and vice versa. So, for me, it's fascinating to see how they were back then and to see how similar they were to us today in many ways.
Yeah, it's really remarkable. So nothing changed, and then it did. All of a
Yeah.
sudden, so you believe 1177 BC was a pivotal moment in the history of civilization. So you said that large empires and small kingdoms that had taken centuries to evolve, they all collapsed rapidly. We should define what you mean by collapse, first of all.
Uh, well, yes, we're going to be here for several hours if we do that. Right. And we also have to define rapidly.
Hmm.
But yes. All right. So collapse is a problem. In fact, I taught an entire class at my university before the new sequel book came out. And it was called Collapse and Resilience in the Ancient World. And we spent 15 weeks trying to define collapse. And it's nearly impossible because everybody has a different definition. All right, so usually when you talk about a societal collapse, you mean that they are, if they even survive at all, if there are any survivors, right? If you don't have everyone wiped out, if there are survivors, they will usually go back to a lower social, economic, and political situation, right? So you basically, I wouldn't say you get nuked back to the Stone Age, but it's close, right? So if you collapse, you would lose, and I'm talking here about a systems collapse, which was originally defined by Colin Renfrew in the late 1970s. He said, if you have a systems collapse of your society, your central administration will go away, your government, your central economy will collapse, your ruling elite, think the 1%, will go away, either died or migrated, and you'll have lots of population either decline or migration, right? So if we were to take, say, Greece as an example, where the Mycenaeans and the Minoans did have a societal collapse, a systemic collapse. In the years after 1177 BC, which we'll come back to, we see the Wanaks, the king of the late Bronze Age. There's no Wanaks anymore in the Iron Age afterward. And an official who was called the Basileus, who had been kind of a lower local official back in the Bronze Age, they're now king in the Iron Age. Basileus takes the place of Wanaks. But Mycenae, abandoned, not abandoned, but nobody's there anymore. Tiryns, Pylos, all the Mycenaean centers, either burnt to the ground or destroyed or just abandoned or some combination thereof. And in the 11th, 10th, 9th centuries, we see much more impoverished villages, shall we say, to the extent that they can be very difficult to find by archaeologists because you don't have monumental stone structures anymore. You've got, wattle and daub and mud huts and things like that. So you really go back to a lower level. And that would be what I consider to be collapse. The problem is that in the aftermath of the late Bronze Age collapse, everybody's affected differently. And that's what I explore in this sequel, the After 1177, because first and foremost, what collapsed is the connections, the network that we were talking about, the diplomacy, the treaties, the marriages, that globalized network. And it's globalized for the Mediterranean, right? That's what Sue Sheridan at Sheffield has talked about. A globalized Mediterranean. That globalized net is what collapses. Each of the G8 societies are affected to one degree or another. Some do collapse and disappear. There is a systems collapse. Others cope or adapt or transform. And that's where it gets into a gray area and muddy because in some of the pushback when my original book came out 2014 on, some of the scholars says it's not a collapse at the end of the late Bronze Age. It's simply a transformation. They're transforming from great empires to small city states. They're transforming from bronze to iron. And I was like, yes and no. Yes, some are transforming, but not everyone. And if you just say, as I heard one scholar say, we shouldn't call it a late Bronze Age collapse. It's the Bronze Age transformation. And I'm like, tell that to all the people that died. That, oh, sorry, yeah, you're just transforming. Your society didn't collapse. I'm like, yeah, actually they did. But as I was working on both the original book and the sequel, if you get 4 different scholars in a room and ask each of them to define collapse, you would get 4 different definitions, right? So I finally, in the sequel, I said, here's the definition that I'm using. And if you don't like it, you can go get your own definition. But I gave about, I think, 5 different sources. So-and-so says this, so-and-so says this. But I would come back to my original definition, as I said to you at the beginning, that it's when you have a systems collapsing. Your government goes away, your economy goes away, lots of people die or migrate, and you go down to a lower level of complexity. And in some cases, they forget how, or they can't make large stone palaces anymore. In the Mycenaean case, they don't need to use linear B for writing anymore because there's no palace that needs an accounting text, and so on, right? And the last thing I'll say before I give the mic back to you is every society in human history has collapsed. That's what I would argue. Some people say, no, they didn't always collapse. They transformed. I'm like, whatever. Everybody has collapsed or transformed such that you don't recognize them anymore. Think of the Roman Empire, right? Follow the Roman Empire. Think of the collapse of the Maya. Think of the collapse of Harappan civilization in the Indus Valley. Everybody has collapsed. So I think it's frankly hubristic to insist that today we are too big to fail. We're not too big to fail. The
Well, we have
Romans
examples
failed.
of this, right?
Yeah.
Right now, Libya and Somalia I suppose would be examples of a total systems collapse. No functioning government, just anarchy reigns, mass migrations.
Yes, we have it everywhere. In fact, I have frequently said in my lectures and in the books that most of the conditions that they had back in 1177 that led to the traumatic breakdown, we've got today as well. I mean, we've got, one for one, and they collapsed. There is no arguing that the Bronze Age was different from the Iron Age. They absolutely did. So, I I frequently these days end my lectures on a very pessimistic note, saying the collapse, it's not a matter of if, it's a matter of when. It's coming. Are we going to be prepared? And then I thank you very much, so much for my ending on that pessimistic note. But yeah.
So the question of what caused these, you said that you documented many cities that were completely or mostly destroyed, but it was unclear whether they were done by humans or by nature. You've mentioned earthquake storms. You've mentioned the sea people. Who were the sea people, and were they to blame? Is this all their fault?
So yeah, it's all their fault. Yeah,
Apart from
thank you.
Helen, I mean,
Yeah.
Helen obviously caused the situation with the trade embargo.
Yeah, that too. Exactly. Yes. Though, even the later Greeks had all kinds of alternate stories about Helen, including one where she spent the war in Egypt. And anyway, fascinating. Yeah, there are a myriad of suggestions for what caused the destructions of the cities, and they're open to interpretation. We've got some scholars saying actually it wasn't as bad of a destruction as some. It's the cow kicking over the lantern, like Mrs. O'Leary's cow in Chicago, as the old song went. But again, I come back to overall, there is a collapse, and we can talk about what happened at one city or another and dispute it till literally the cows come home and kick over the lantern. But the end result is that many of the major cities see some sort of destruction and basically go out of use. Now, what caused it is what I think is fascinating because we're not always sure. In some cases, we can tell that an earthquake did hit. There's very good evidence at Troy, for example. Troy 6, the walls are tilting. Definitely an earthquake hit it. Mycenae, there are fallen walls everywhere, dead bodies underneath walls, and so on. There look like there's up to 50 years of earthquakes at this time. It's called an earthquake storm. If your first earthquake does not get rid of all of the built up pressure, you'll have another earthquake a week later, maybe a year later, and it can take up to 60 years to unzip a fault. We see this today in Turkey. The North Anatolian fault line has been unzipping since like 1949, and that's
Hmm.
why you get these earthquakes. And then once all the pressure is gone, it'll take another 400 years to build up. So I think some of the cities are destroyed by earthquakes. Others are destroyed by human invaders. You've actually got an army. And in fact, a recently deciphered and published tablet from Ugarit, the city on the coast of North Syria, says an army of the enemy has landed at our port city and is now advancing on Ugarit. So that's in writing. And the excavators found a meter of debris, right? Like 3 feet of debris with arrowheads embedded in the walls. It's pretty obvious that Ugarit was destroyed by a human army, not by Mother Nature and an earthquake. And indeed, Ugarit's not inhabited for like another 400 years after that.
I wanted to
All right.
mention that actually because that seemed to be the example of perhaps the ancient world's worst streak of bad luck. This Ugarit
Oh,
things,
yeah.
like they're trading with
Yeah.
Egypt and everything's going fine. Earthquake hits,
Yes.
but it doesn't destroy it. Uh, they
Yeah.
send aid to the Hittites, so they're doing well enough. They have a surplus, and then a famine arrives, and they get food aid from Egypt, and then the
Right.
enemy ships show up, overrun everything, destroy the
Yeah.
place, 2 meters of debris, and it's not reoccupied for centuries. It's an
Yeah.
amazing story.
Exactly. I know, which is crazy because in some ways Ugarit was where you wanted to live before 1200 BC. It was this amazing international ports, entrepot stuff from everywhere, and then all of a sudden, boom, boom, boom! Wow, series of unfortunate events, as they say. Right. So yeah, you've got earthquake. Um, And as you just mentioned, some of the other recently deciphered and published tablets mention famine. And so we now know that they were starving in Ugarit also. Now, part of the problem is that when you're an archaeologist and you're excavating a destroyed city, it's pretty obvious it's destroyed. It's not always obvious what destroyed it. So, an earthquake destruction in many ways looks very much like destruction by humans. I mean, especially if a human army knocks over walls, pushes down houses, right? That kind of looks like an earthquake. The big difference is that if you have a human invader, you'll have arrowheads like we have, buried in the walls and such. But bodies in the streets, bodies under the building, that could be either humans or Mother Nature. So, regardless, they are destroyed, but we're not always sure what happened. As far as what caused all of this, you mentioned the Sea Peoples and all of that. This is still under debate. And this is actually why Rob Tempio wanted me to write the original book. He's like, what happened? Why was there the collapse? I'm like, oh boy, what didn't happen? Right. So I go through at the beginning and end of the original book, I go through the various causes. The middle of the book, I talk about what collapsed: Mycenaeans, Minoans, Hittites, Egyptians. I give the background, again, to put it into context. But of the various possibilities, back when I was in school as an undergraduate and graduate, I was first taught that it was the Sea Peoples. This is a group of nine, it's actually nine different groups that the Egyptians tell us invaded Egypt twice. Once in what we would now say is 1207 BC, and then again 30 years later in what would be 1177 BC, which is where the title of the book comes from. All right, so 1177 is not actually the year civilization collapsed, despite the clickbait subtitle of the book. It is the year that the Sea Peoples came a second time. So, who are the Sea Peoples? Good question. We don't know. Still trying to find them. There are nine different groups. Some come in the first wave, others come in the second wave, and some come during both waves. So we have the Egyptians, who did not call them Sea Peoples. That's our modern name for them. The French made it up. But the Egyptians tell us one group is called the Shurdin or Shardana, and we think they may have come from Sardinia. Note the similarity of the names. But that might be, what they say when I was learning French. It could be a faux ami, a false friend, right? Just because it looks like it doesn't mean. But let's say for right now, Shurdin or Shardana come from Sardinia. The Shekelesh, we think they might have come from Sicily. The Peleset are the only ones we think we know. The Peleset have long been identified with the Philistines, like the biblical Philistines. And that's probably accurate. The Peleset are the Philistines. The others we're not so sure of. There's one group called the Ekwesh, who could be Homer's Achaeans, which is his name for the Mycenaeans. But there's another group called the Danuna or Denyan, and those could be Homer's Danaans, which is his other name for the Mycenaeans. So it could be that you have Mycenaean Greeks in here. And what I think, and some scholars agree, some disagree, I think that the migrations, which is really what they are, the migrations start in the Western Mediterranean, in Sicily, Sardinia, and northern Italy, which now is showing evidence for a drought at about this time. And it's been hypothesized that more than 100,000 people might have left northern Italy at that time, in which case they would be the beginnings of the Sea Peoples. They're migrating and they are overrunning Greece and Turkey and Cyprus and North Syria, to put it in modern terms. But they're not this invading force. They're not this bogeyman that I was taught about, that I used to scare my kids with when they wouldn't go to sleep. Right? Go to sleep or the Peleset are going to get you. Right? So it's now been suggested that they might have been as much victims as they were oppressors. And again, think of the migrants today that are fleeing the civil war in Syria, for example, that are coming up out of Africa. and trying to make it to Europe. We've got the same sort of thing today. So if it's not the sea peoples, then who is it? Well, some of the other things that were floated by me in graduate school, especially, I think needed to be reconsidered. So drought had been suggested, famine had been suggested, earthquakes had been suggested, disease had been suggested. And when I went through the evidence and actually laid it out and put it into the original, or rather the revised version of the book, which has more data that came out in 2021, I eventually said, okay, if I have to choose between drought and famine and invaders and disease and earthquakes, I'm going to say yes. I'm going to say yes, all of the above. It's a perfect storm. And something you had said earlier, if you get hit with an earthquake, a lot of people are going to die, yes, but your society is not going to be completely trashed. Same thing with disease. A pandemic runs through, lots of people die. We just saw that with COVID, but it doesn't bring down an entire civilization. Same thing with the others. So, what I figured out is, to my mind, the perfect storm is the only solution where you have a series of unfortunate events that either happen simultaneously or so close in rapid succession that you don't have time to recover from one before the next one hits, right? So you get a drought, obviously you have famine, but with that can come pestilence and disease. And with that, maybe somebody else starts migrating because they've got drought and famine and they invade your land. And then all of a sudden, out of the blue, and totally unrelated, probably, you get hit with an earthquake. At some point, you're going to throw up your hands and go, I could have survived one of them. I might have survived two. Three and four simultaneously, forget about it. Right. And I think that's what happens in this period after 1200 BC. I would have loved to have lived back in the late Bronze Age from the 15th to the 13th century. I would not have wanted to live in the decades after 1200 BC because everything went down just in a matter of decades. And by the end of the 11th century, everything that they had was pretty much gone.
So I was going to ask you, like, how would that compare to the collapse of Rome? Because that seemed like a very gradual process of erosion. Like there were barbarian invasions, then it's okay for a while, and it seems as though the people that lived through that may not have known that they were living through a collapse. But this is much more rapid, it sounds like.
Yeah, and still, even so, I'm not sure they realized they were living through a collapse. That's one of the questions I've been asking myself, and that I ask in the book is when they were collapsing, did they know they were collapsing? So yeah, Rome is a slow collapse, and in fact, you could say that it was declining and collapsing for 200 years or so, right? But to be fair, our collapse, late Bronze Age, if it's a systems collapse, that can take up to a century, can take up to 100 years also. And indeed, we see things continue throughout the 12th century. So from 1200 to 1100. So it's not, immediate. It does take a while. But there are some indications that some of them knew that something was wrong. So, for example, there is a study that was published that showed the Egyptians began to interbreed their cattle. They took their regular cattle and they interbreeded them with zebu or zebu cattle, which are more drought resistant, more hardy. And so they're definitely interbreeding the cattle to be able to live in more drought-like conditions. Similarly, it looks like they're kind of like overplanting, if you could say that, the regions of Canaan that the Egyptians were in charge of. And indeed, they do send relief ships full of grain up to the Hittites and up to Ugarit. They also sent dried fish and all that. So there were some people, I think, that must have been aware, maybe not of exactly what was going to happen, but that things were wrong and that they hadn't had rain in a decade and that there were earthquakes and all that. So I think there were some people trying to do what we would call today mitigating efforts or risk management, that type of thing. But I also think the vast majority had no idea. And of course, they had no idea what was causing it, right? There's a drought in the Hittite lands, they prayed to the gods. Don't know if that did any good, but so, um, yeah, I always wonder in these types of collapses, did they actually know what was going on? And you can ask that of the Maya, of the Romans, of the Harappans. And in our case, I think it was probably only clear to somebody living later, looking back and going, oh my God, do you realize what we lost? And you have a perfect example with the Greek poet or author Hesiod, writing in the 8th century, where he looks back and goes, oh, that was the age of heroes and mythical heroes and the age of gold. And there's 5 ages. And I'm now living in the Iron Age. Oh, woe betide me. But, he's looking back retroactively. And in fact, that was one of the things that Colin Renfrew said about a systems collapse, is that it's frequently followed by what we would call the Dark Age, in which they romanticized the earlier period that was now lost. And so I would just say, look at Homer, look at
Uh,
the Iliad and the Odyssey. The one thing, though, and this is something I go into in the sequel, is I don't think we should call the period after the collapse a dark age anymore. I know it's what we used to call it. I think it'd be far better just to call it the Iron Age, which is what most scholars are advocating. Just like the medievalists don't want their period of dark age anymore. Now they're like late antiquity. So I don't want dark age for ours anymore. Just call it an Iron Age, which is what it was.
yeah, that makes sense too, because in the sequel after 1177 BC, it's a mixed bag for what happens to all of
Mhm.
these people. Some really survive and thrive, others are wiped out, and some
Yeah,
are just dealt a staggering blow that they never recover from. Like you said, the Egyptians, they obviously continued as a civilization, but they were never quite the same again. They were never as
right.
powerful as they once were. But why not? Do we know? Do we know why they
No, we
never
don't
came back?
know. Not quite. And this is one of the things that I was trying to figure out to see if there might be any lessons for us today to look at them. Basically, in the sequel, where I ended up presenting it geographically rather than chronologically, I had started out chronologically and I got whiplash going Assyrians, no Babylonians, no Cypriots. So much better geographically, because what we've got essentially is 8 case studies of what to do or not to do if your society collapses, which I think is relevant to us today. All right, what are we going to do if we collapse? So some of them did very, very, very well. The Phoenicians, for example, who are the surviving central Canaanites in what is today Lebanon, and the Cypriots. They both do well. They do so well that they're what I call anti-fragile, which is taking the term from Nassim Nicholas Taleb, who had a book called that. And if you're anti-fragile, you're not only transforming, you are flourishing in a chaotic age. You're taking advantage of the chaotic conditions. And so the Phoenicians, for example, and that's what we call them, they never called themselves Phoenicians. It's a later name. They would have said, I'm from Sidon, I'm from Beirut, I'm from Byblos. They take over when Ugarit goes down, and they're the ones that then go out into the Mediterranean, bringing the alphabet, which they had standardized by that time, which essentially replaces everything we had talked about, cuneiform and Akkadian and all that, much easier to write the Phoenician alphabet or a variant of it than to learn cuneiform and to do, Akkadian or to learn Egyptian, which democratized the writing systems. It used to be back in the late Bronze Age, maybe 1% of the people were literate. Now everyone could read or write. It's just like what, 26 vowels and consonants. And so the Phoenicians spread the standardized alphabet, and they also they standardized purple dye, the production of purple dye, and that gets spread. And so they're up there flourishing.
But so
Cypriots,
what was it that made them so resilient? Why them?
that I don't know.
Hmm.
That I don't know. That's where what I say is my discussions will begin the dialogue. They will not end it. And the problem is especially with the Phoenicians, is most of their cities are underneath, the ancient cities are underneath the modern cities, right? So there hasn't been all that much, relatively speaking, excavation there. So I'm not quite sure, but I'm interested. I think we need to figure that out. What made them resilient? What made them transform? Same thing with the Cypriots. They were able to pivot, and they seem to be at the forefront of iron technology and making iron weapons and tools, which, contrary to a lot of what you see out on the internet, iron does not come into mass production and be used by everybody until after the collapse of the late Bronze Age. The Sea Peoples do not have iron weapons. The Dorian invasion, they do not have iron weapons. In fact, I say at the beginning of the new book, there was no Dorian invasion. At most, it was a migration. So the Cypriots, it looks like now, are the ones responsible for switching basically from bronze to iron.
And is
But
that is that
why
just
them?
is that because tin was no longer available? So they had to come up with
Well,
something else?
maybe, maybe that was the favorite suggestion back in the 70s and 80s. Supply chain was cut. You can't get tin. You got to pivot and use something else. And that may still be the case to a certain extent, but there is now more evidence that copper is still available, that tin may have been getting through. So it might not have been as dire a situation as we used to think. Still, I think times were tough, and it may be that there wasn't as much of a demand for bronze in
Hmm.
the aftermath of the
Oh,
collapse because people couldn't afford it. So, for whatever reason, the Cypriots are like, "Hey, we accidentally have been smelting some iron while we're casting, working on the copper. Let's and if you do it properly, iron keeps a better edge. Iron can be sharper. It's better for tools, not to mention weapons. So the Cypriots seem to take that case. And so there I can see why they were able to do it. Because I'm like, you work in one metal, a little different, but you can work in the other. Other ones, though, like why did the Egyptians go through basically a period of anarchy? That, we'll have to talk to an Egyptologist, but all I could point to is say, well, Egypt does this every so often. It's kind of a cycle, right? The period after the collapse in Egypt is the third intermediate period. And so, yes, there was a first and a second. And so you've got the Old Kingdom back in like the third millennium, and then you have the first intermediate period. Then you have the Middle Kingdom, and you have the second intermediate period, which is when the Hyksos come in the early second millennium BC. Then you have the New Kingdom, which is the height, basically, of the Egyptians, 18th dynasty, King Tut, Hatshepsut, all those people. And afterward, you have the third intermediate period. So by definition, it is a period of anarchy and chaos anyway, such that at one point you have three or even four different people claiming that they're all the Pharaoh of Egypt and they're each in a different little pocket. So, but it may be, I was just at a workshop last week where an Egyptologist said, maybe we're looking at it wrong. Maybe our idea of Egypt, and I kind of ranked them middle of the road in terms of how well they did. Not as well as some, but better than others. They said, you're working on the assumption that a monolithic, unified Egypt is the best way, that would be your number one. It's like, what if we look at Egypt differently? What if we look at it as breaking into geographical areas and it's more like a series of city-states like you would have in later Greece with Athens and Megara and Corinth and Sparta? She said, in that case, Egypt has transformed. Egypt should actually be up in your first level because they're like, okay, what was working back then is not working. Let's fix things. And she's like, maybe you need to rethink how you define Egypt, which I think is a great point. And I think we really could bring that in. But others are much more straightforward.
can I
Like
one
Assyrians.
Egypt question?
Yeah. Yeah.
When was the period of Meroe and the Sudanese, the Nubian
So
ruling?
that's going to come just a little bit later than
Mm,
all of this. Like
okay.
I end the book in the 8th century, and we're going to get things like the 26th dynasty and onward. And that's when you get Kushite and Nubian and then eventually Meroe. But Meroe is quite a bit later,
Hmm.
right? They're almost interacting with the Hellenistic kings
Okay, yeah,
at
trying to
some
keep
point.
the
So
timeline straight. Yeah.
exactly. So that'll be in the next book. There's going to be a third book in
Oh,
the
excellent.
unintended. Yeah, I'm calling it the unintended trilogy because I never meant to do it. But I'm gonna go from 776 BC, which is the traditional date for the first Greek Olympics, and take it down through the death of Alexander.
Oh, wow.
And
That'll
yeah,
be
so
interesting.
another 400 years, and it will be called. I wanted to call it after 1177, but no. So it'll be 776 BC, the clashing of civilizations.
Hmm.
So after 1170 is the survival. This will be the clashing because we're going to have the Persian Wars and the Peloponnesian Wars and Alexander the Great and all of that. And so that's where we're going to get into the Cushites and the Nubians and tap into Meroe and all of that. So we're going to, stay tuned. It'll take me another 5 or 6 years, but we'll get there. We'll get there. But so that's where they come in,
Mhm.
right?
Okay.
So
So you were
right.
saying about the
So
Assyrians and Babylonians before I cut in
yeah.
there.
So we have we have the gamut, and what I did was I used uh, I might not have, should have, possibly used, but I did. It might be anachronistic. I used the definitions from the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, right? The people that every year say we're all going to die, and that won or shared the Nobel Peace Prize in 2007. They, in their annual reports, they give a great definition for what is transformation, what is adaptation, what is coping, and especially in a publication that came out in 2012 on risk management and disasters. The IPCC more usually focuses on things like Hurricane Katrina, right? And what do you do in the aftermath of a modern disaster? But they define something called an extreme impact event. And had they looked at the late Bronze Age collapse, which they didn't because they almost never look at archaeology, which I think they should. I've told them that now. An extreme impact event, that's the late Bronze Age collapse. Absolutely. And the reaction of societies to an extreme impact event is either you just cope, that is, you're like, oh my God, can I make it to tomorrow or next week? Or you adapt, which is like, okay, we're going to be fine, but we need to change certain things. Or the highest level is we transform. That can never happen again. We have to do this. We have to change our thinking. We have to change from bronze to iron. We have to change from linear B and cuneiform to the Phoenician alphabet, right? And so using those definitions and also using something that is more frequently used in biology and socioeconomics, the adaptive cycle. The adaptive cycle boils down to the rise and fall of civilizations, right? And in the book, I actually borrow a line from Hamilton: "Oceans rise, empires fall," right? And it basically says that every civilization or empire goes in a cycle, and that collapse is a natural part, and then a resurgence. And that resurgence, which is what we were calling the Dark Age, is a period of inventiveness and innovation. Again, think of the switch from bronze to iron. That is innovation. That's inventive. So what I did was I assigned numerically values to the categories with these definitions, and I took the 8 societies and I ranked them. I gave them a number. And so that's where the Cypriots and Phoenicians wind up in the top category, and the Hittites wind up in the bottom category. Egypt is kind of halfway in between. The Assyrians and Babylonians are in number 2. They transform, they're resilient, but not as anti-fragile as the Cypriots and the Phoenicians. And in each case, I tried to ask why, which is what you asked, right? Why? And in the case of the Assyrians and Babylonians, I was able to say they kept their central administration. You still have the king. You still have all of the upper level courtiers and all that. They kept their centralized economy. They kept their writing system. They kept the monumental building. they basically kept everything, even though a lot of people died or migrated. And okay, so it's like a kid continuing asking why, right? Okay, so why did they survive? Because they kept these institutions. Why did they keep the institutions? Well, I'm not sure, but I think the fact that they were on the Tigris and Euphrates had something to do with that. Their water supply was still there. So when the drought hit, which it did, but it hits a little bit later, they're able to survive for a little bit longer, though even they resort to cannibalism at one point, one of the texts says. But I think it's because their water source was still there. But not only that, one rather famous Assyriologist suggested very simply that they had the right leaders in place at the right time. So Nebuchadnezzar the First, for example, leader of the Babylonians, Tukulti Ninirtu the First of the Assyrians, they were the right people to lead their people through the chaotic conditions. And he suggested that it may have staved off the collapse for the Assyrians and Babylonians by as much as 100 years. But when they get lesser leaders, and the drought finally catches up, and the Euphrates, I think it might be the Tigris, one of them changes their course. At that point, they go down for a while. But when they come back up, it's, as I say in the book, with a vengeance. And eventually the Neo-Assyrians take over the entire Near East in the 9th and 8th centuries and become once again one of the world's empires. So this question of why, we can sometimes provide a hypothesis, but we're never sure. And that is a bit frustrating because if we knew why, we could then try to apply those lessons for us today, especially if we start going down the slippery slope. So I tried as best I could, but it's both the beauty and the curse of archaeology and ancient history is we only have pieces of the puzzle. We only have part of the picture, and we have to extrapolate the rest.
So you've said that you think future historians will look back at 2020 as another such pivotal moment. Why?
Well, I was thinking at the time because of the pandemic, but also because, and not just I mean, yes, I chose 2020 because you have to pick a year, right? 1177, 476 for the Romans, even though it didn't happen in 476. 2020 is a good pivotal year to look at because of everything that was going on. Both, I was thinking in part from the US, but also around the world. So in and around that time, let's say 2018, 2019 to 2024, you had things like the pandemic. You had January 6th. You had Black Lives Matter movement. You had, lots of things going on. And if you're looking back at us and say, well, they collapsed soon afterward, it's going to be those things that the future historians point to. And will say, yeah, it was a perfect storm. Any one of them would not have brought them down. But the combination, I mean, they would have said what I said for antiquity. And so I'm saying, I'm hypothesizing, if we go down, that is the year or the era that future historians are going to point to. But I also try to end on an optimistic note. And I'm actually already seeing on the internet and the reviews there, which I know one should never read one's reviews, but some of the people are calling the sequel much more positive than the original, which I'm like, okay, fine. And somebody actually called it anti-doom. I'm like, it's not really anti-doom. It's, what's going to happen if. And so I end by asking at the very end, and I don't want to steal a future question from you, but the Phoenicians are up top. The Mycenaeans are down in number 4 because they don't really do very well. And I ask the reader, I guess I kind of break the barrier, and I say to the reader, are we going to be Phoenicians or are we going to be Mycenaeans if and when we collapse? And then I say, we're going to have to leave it to future historians to tell us what we were. That is, were we anti-fragile and we transformed and we're great, or were Mycenaeans and we really failed to make the grade? And future historians are going to have to tell us whether we succeeded or failed.
Well, you're not making me feel very well about the Babylonian or Assyrian option here, because I mean I've got Justin Trudeau at home, so having the right leader in the right place at the right time. Ours doesn't think about monetary policy. So
Yeah, yeah,
have you
yeah.
read Peter Zion's recent book, The End of the World is Just the Beginning?
I have skimmed it. I've got it. It was recommended to me, but I haven't digested it
Mm.
yet, if I may. You have an opinion on this?
No, it's just interesting because he talks about the collapse of globalization, like due to demographic reasons, supply chains eventually breaking down. This whole globalized system that we've built shrinking inwards, in part because of demography. These
Hmm.
aging societies, and we don't have the consumer base to support this globalized economy anymore, and also because if I remember correctly, the U.S. pulls backwards and is no longer policing the sea lanes and enabling
Hmm.
safe trade everywhere. And that's when you mentioned 2020 and all these other things that happened, these supply chain issues. I mean, going
Hmm.
home, I couldn't get
Hmm.
a rental car when I visited home
Hmm.
because there just no cars to
Right,
be found. So
right.
that lends a lot of credence to what you're saying too. It's interesting.
Yeah, well, I'll have to take a look at that in more detail because one thing I'm able to do, fortunately, is that when the paperback comes out, which I hope it will, I mean, one never knows, but if the hardback is successful, usually 18 months to 2 years later, a paperback comes out. At that point, and I already talked to my editor, I said, can I tweak the text at that point? And he was like, no, but you can add an afterword and say how things have changed in the interval. And I'm already at work on that because I think most people don't realize this, but the length of time that a manuscript spends in press before it actually comes out, right, can be up a year or more,
Hmm.
right? So my book, this new sequel, came out mid-April 2024. When did I turn in the manuscript? May of 2023.
Yeah.
When was the last time I was able to make changes? July 2023. So there was a period of 9 months when I couldn't touch it. And yet every week new things were published. I have a folder in my Dropbox account that has 147 books and articles that came out in those 9 months when I was not able to touch my manuscript, almost all of which are relevant. And so, what I'm about to do, in fact, later today, I'm going to start going through those 147 books and articles and earmarking what parts I need to mention in the new afterword and say, I wasn't able to put this in the book because it came out while it was in press. And but here is what you need to know. So in chapter 3, we might want to tweak it slightly and say this now based on so and so. So this book, Zion,
Yeah.
Peter Zion, will be my 148th, though I do think I already have it in there. I just, haven't devoted the time to it. This is the problem, while you're doing the book and everything else, I'm juggling classes, teaching, grading, getting grant proposals, service to the department. And so every so often I'm like, okay, it is Tuesday. I'm shutting off my email, turning off my phone, and it's just going to be me and the computer. But those days are so far and few between. So, but anyway, if there are other books out there like that, people should let me know, and especially ones that will make what I've been doing even more relevant to today, because I definitely think that the past informs the present and should also inform the future. I do think that there are lessons to be learned, even though they lived 3,000 years ago and we're in a totally different technological society. Still, we get one big bomb that goes off in the atmosphere and fries all of our electronics. What we're back to what? Before the steam age? Back to the stone age, we're gonna be reading and writing Akkadian again before you know it.
Right, your skills will come in handy there. Well, you've queued up
Yeah,
the future quite nicely too. At the end of this book, you had said that the Iron Age was the start of something new. That this collapse opened the door for the growth of a new world on a more human scale, and that's what we can look forward to in your next book. So thank you for Eric for shedding light on this fascinating period. I really enjoyed both books. Again, it's 1177 BC, the year civilization collapsed, and after 1177 BC, the survival of civilizations. Really outstanding.
great.
Highly recommended.
Thank you. I'm glad you liked it, and I hope the readers like it. And for those that are not fans of texts books, there's actually now a graphic version where we've translated it. Clintus Fox and I translated the original book into an inch thick 250 pages of cartoons. I mean, it's a comic book. So if you like your images instead, you can do that too. But I'm very glad to hear that you liked both books. That's music to my ears.
Well, we'll go back to the comic books once we lose reading and writing in the next 5-10 years. So that'll come in really handy for all of us.
There you go.
All
Yeah.
right, I'll let you get back to work. Thank you very much.
All right, my pleasure. Take care, and thank you again for having me on.
Thanks for listening to this episode of Personal Landscapes. If you like the podcast, please give it a rating on iTunes and subscribe through your favorite app. You can find links to today's podcast and more conversations on Books About Place at ryanmurdoch.com. You'll also find a donate button if you'd like to contribute to the costs of the show. All donations are greatly appreciated.